Jesus freak here. Now I know that it sounds like a bit of a contradiction. When I push for keeping the King James Version as the standard, when I myself admit that I like the RSV, apart from its textual base. I don't like the fact that they use Nestle Aland, but uh, you take the good with the bad. But you've noticed that I almost never use the RSV in my videos. Or, for example, this New King James that I got to replace one that my ex-girlfriend's puppy destroyed about 10 years ago. Because it's the same text block, just published by Holman instead of Nelson. But if I were King James only, obviously I wouldn't have this. Still, you'll notice that I do put particular emphasis on the King James Version. It's the one I use for my readings. And about 99.5% of the time, when I'm quoting the Bible on my videos here, in English at least, I have other versions I use for Spanish and Portuguese. If I were to ever use Portuguese, I hope I don't have to use Portuguese. Because I can't pronounce it. My friend called me out on that, trying to pronounce Portuguese, and I sounded like an idiot. Because it was his native language. But almost always, except for the rare cases that I need to rely on something, some peculiarity where I can't use the King James, like talking about various uses of the faith, hope, love triad in the Pauline epistles, I have to use the New King James for that. So you ask, if I don't have, if my favorite translation isn't the King James, I'm willing to use translations from as recently as the 80s. New King James from 85. If I've done my own translation of the New Testament, why am I sticking with the King Jimmy? Why am I sticking with the King Jimmy? Well, question isn't it? I've said that we got our modern English mainly from three people. William Caxton, first printed books in English. William Tyndale, who brought us most of the Bible, including the whole New Testament, translated from the original languages into English for the first time, and whose influence is still felt on modern translations, including the RSV, the ESV, the NASB, and the New King James. And William Shakespeare. And The King James Version of the Bible in particular, as well as the 1662 Anglican Book of Common Prayer, have been a major influence on our language. And without them, a lot of things in our language make no sense. What are you talking about? The powers that be? What are you talking about? Holier than thou? There's a lot of figures of speech that derive directly from the King James Version of the Bible. You can't throw that all away without losing the context behind a lot of figures of speech that we have in our modern language. This is actually the main reason I keep to the King James. Not the translators were special, or the text space was special. I actually think we lose a lot culturally without the King James. And maybe that's a strange tack to take. But that's what I believe. In church, I prefer the King James for a different reason. I feel that since we've lost having one standard translation that everyone uses, that we've run into a lot of confusion. All this talk about Mandela effects and all this stuff because people are getting different translations of the Bible confused in their heads. Until very recently, we had one standard. That really mostly changed in my lifetime. I figure that it's best to have one standard and that the standard that's just worked is perfectly sufficient. That's why I prefer to keep the King James in the church. I don't get into the whole text issue. I have my opinion on the matter. I've told you my opinion on it. But my choice of the King James as a standard has nothing to do with it. I don't prefer the Textus Receptus because of the King James, and I don't prefer the King James because of the Textus Receptus. They're unrelated. But having a standard averts the confusion. Now, I'm going to be the weird person here. I tell people, a lot of times maybe a Strong's is overkill. And I'll recommend the McCrudens instead. And, they're both concordances. They're wholly different beasts. Strong's is a concordance so you can study the original languages key to the King James. The Crudens is specifically a concordance of the King James. And which you're going to want is going to depend on what you want to do. Well, I'm not going to say, you shouldn't go into those other translations. Of course, maybe if you're new in the faith, just stick to the King James. Don't worry about it. And I'm not going to say don't dive into the original language. I haven't. Most of my work was from Latin because Latin's an easier language for an English speaker. I'm not going to say don't. What I will say is that you can get by with just the King James. That's plenty enough. But that's different from what your King James ugly types are going to say. When you got people saying, oh, if you want the true message of salvation, you got to learn English. That's a horrible thing to tell people. I like what Trinitarians doing. They're trying to make sure there's decent translations from the same text base as the King James. You know, not necessarily from the King James. That's not really a good idea either. I have one of their completed jobs. I've shown you this. I have this Portuguese Bible produced by Trinitarian. As far as I can tell, too, it's a pretty good translation. I'm not going to push someone to say, oh, you can't read the Bible unless you know English or whatever. I'm not going to talk about 7 stages of perfection of the English Bible like Galen, God, and Ripplinger does. Or go even further and say there were 7 stages of purification of the English Bible and then another 7 stages of purification of the King James Version itself, which is what Matthew for sure teaches. I don't put any perfection on the King James. It is what it is. It's a good translation. It's the Word of God. And maybe having to dig through to understand the ye old English. I call it, Jacobean because it's Jacobean and Elizabethan. Maybe having to dig is going to strengthen your faith. Maybe it'll help your understanding of other things. It's good to learn. That's my stance on this subject. Jesus freak out.